Hi, everyone, and welcome to our fourth lecture, The Ages of Audiovisual Media. Last week, we have focused on cultural heritage and what it means, and we've covered a very brief history of heritage in the Middle East. Today, we'll be talking about other forms of cultural production, mainly cinema and television. I should say that today's lecture tries to cover too much ground about something that we know too little about. Broadly, this is true of mass media in the Middle East, but it's certainly true of the media forms, industries, and histories that I'll address in today's lecture. I will be talking about cinema and television over a period starting roughly in the 1930s and extending to this day, using cases ranging from Cairo's mid-20th century film industry, to Kabul's state-controlled media institutions, to Istanbul's contemporary TV drama industry. Notice that I say Cairo, Kabul, and Istanbul instead of Egypt, Afghanistan, and Turkey. And there are two important reasons for this. First, film and television content has been overwhelmingly produced in urban centers. And this is the case all over the world, by the way. It's as true in Los Angeles and Bombay as it is in Cairo and Istanbul. So it's not a specifically Middle Eastern thing. And there are many reasons behind this concentration of media production in urban centers. Access to capital and imported technologies, access to a trained labor force, access to specialized facilities for shooting and post-production, all of which have historically been concentrated in major urban centers. Second, we still know too little about media production and consumption outside of urban centers. There's relatively little written about smaller film scenes in Algiers, Beirut, or Istanbul, for example, and there are very, very few empirical studies of film and TV consumption outside the region's capitals. I wish I could assign you readings to tell you more about how people watch and understand audiovisual media in eastern Turkey or in southern Iran or in the Moroccan Reef or in the Egyptian countryside. But this topic is seriously understudied, so we're focusing mostly on the urban aspect today. I want you to bear in mind two questions while watching today's lecture. First, I want you to think about what a mass medium is, and implicitly, as we've discussed briefly in week 2, what media are in general. Right? This is not just to be cheeky about terminology, but to show how this question cannot be easily solved by saying that one specific thing is a medium, right? To just say cinema is a medium or television is a medium, right? Is the content what the medium is about, or is it the assumptions and social relations guiding the audience's interpretation of the content? Or is it the social and technical infrastructure necessary to broadcast it and distribute it? Clearly, all of these elements enter into our conception of what mass media are, but it's good to think about the complexity of all these components that constitute a medium, because definite answers tend to obscure this complexity. Second, I want you to pay attention to the historical relationship between mass media and the emergence of national culture. And I mean national culture in the way anthropologists use the term, right, as a kind of coherent sum of practices and symbols over a given national territory. Throughout the lecture, I want you to think about all the ways in which cinema and television, as technological infrastructures, as purveyors of narrative content, as spaces of media production, contribute or don't contribute to constructing the ideas and practices associated with a national culture. Now, I need to mention that cinema and television are not the only media of national expression, and they're certainly not the oldest, right? One could simply look at the thriving illustrated magazine scene of the 1920s and 1930s, which Walter Armbrust discusses extensively in the case of Egypt in Mass Culture and Modernism in Egypt, which is on your key readings list. Or look at the ways in which nationalist sentiments were articulated in radio programming well before there were any TV sets. So this is important to bear in mind. Now, the lecture will be divided into 4 main sections. I will begin by briefly talking about the most common approach in Middle Eastern media studies, which tends to lack the kind of historical and ethnographic attention to mass media that this lecture, as well as others in this series, will provide. The lecture will be afterwards divided according to a broad chronological progression through different ages of audiovisual media, hence the lecture's title. I'll begin in the 1930s and end today, and I'll be going back and forth between my empirical cases and some broader historical pointers. The second section will move to a very brief history of early audiovisual media industries through the case of Egyptian cinema. I'll use this case to illustrate what media industries look like without direct state intervention or in funding and distribution. and how even prior to state intervention in the cultural sector, commercial films had a direct bearing on the creation of a quote-unquote national culture, which is especially obvious in the case of Egypt. The third section moves to the age of state intervention and media regulation, and I will explore this issue through the little-known case of cinema made in Kabul. This is an era where the link between audiovisual media production and the creation of a national culture was most clearly driven and controlled by national media institutions. And the final section will talk about cinema and television in the satellite age, and the major technological and economic shifts that happened afterwards in the audiovisual media industries. I'll also briefly discuss how satellite television content can still produce powerful nationalist narratives through the example of a TV drama series called Dirilish Ertuğrul, or Resurrection Ertuğrul, in Turkey. So let's move to the first section. The most common approach to the history of cinema and television in Middle Eastern media studies is to write about the institutions, laws, technologies, and money flows that constitute a media industry, what one can roughly call a kind of political economy of mass media. And this approach is represented in books such as the one you see right here, Douglas Boyd's Classical Broadcasting in the Arab World, which was initially published in 1982 and for a long time was actually the only thing written in English about media in the Middle East. There are more recent examples of this trend. Noah Mellor, Mohammad Aish, Nabil Dajani's, and Khalil Rinawi's Arab Media, Naomi Sakra's Arab Television Today, or Touria Gaibes's National Broadcasting and State Policy in Arab Countries, which is on your reading list. It's the one furthest to the right. These books have a somewhat boring approach because what you'll find in them is what I call institutional factoids, right? For example, you'll find out that television broadcasting in Algeria was introduced under the auspices of French colonialism and then was nationalized in 1963. Or you'll find out that Iraq established its first television channel in 1956 under the monarchy, or that Egypt introduced a national television broadcasting system mirroring its radio broadcasting system in 1960. So these books are important because there's very little basic research on media industries in the region. For example, almost nothing is written about radio and advertising in the Arab world. But these books are still prone to a lot of pitfalls and blind spots. I don't say this to invalidate that scholarship, but just to encourage you to dig deeper into what might seem at first like a kind of straightforward description of mass media that they give. Right? One important pitfall is in the political economy literature is how mass media becomes a naturalized category, right? And how divisions between cinema, television, advertising, music, and photography are reified when they are not all that sharp in practice. We speak of the Egyptian film industry, or the Gulf-based music video industry, or the Turkish television drama industry. And I wanted you to alert you to this way of speaking because I use these terms as a shorthand. But it's important to step back and think about what we actually mean by them and where we trace the boundary between these media industries, because in practice, they're often integrated in all sorts of different ways depending on the different countries. As an aside, I think it's also important to note that these divisions don't neatly map onto national boundaries. Just to take the Egyptian film industry as an example, you can't understand what's happening in the industry if you just look within Egypt's national borders, right? There's talent coming from across the Arab world to work in Egypt. There's equipment and expertise coming from European multinational corporations. There's important capital flows coming, for example, from the Gulf, which funded the industry essentially until the 2010s. And so fixating on national borders tends to obscure these transnational links. And this is a problem in some of the kind of Middle Eastern media studies. One last pitfall with this literature is the assumption that cinema and television are coherent technologies that get introduced everywhere in the same way, either through state institutions or through the private sector. Even in Euro-American context, however, television, just to take that example, was an amalgamation of technical innovations and socio-political decisions about who gets to control broadcasting technology and how people access these broadcasts, right? So it's not just sufficient to say television was introduced in this country or that country as though you were installing a TV set in your living room. But we have to look at the different intermediaries and technologies involved in setting up this infrastructure. And again, there's little research in this area so far in the Middle East. So, I won't have that much to give you to read about this. So, let me begin my broad historical survey, and specifically starting with Egyptian cinema. Egypt is among the very first countries in the world to encounter cinema. The canonical film histories will give you a very exact date, which is 1896, when the Lumière brothers went on a world tour from Paris to present an invention called the cinématographe. And they stopped in Alexandria, Egypt, that year to show their invention. This anecdote is seized upon by nationalist film historians to say that Egypt was the second country in the world to witness the arrival of cinema, which is historically inaccurate. But the important point is that from very early on, Egypt was very much integrated in the global circuits of capital, labor, and technology that allowed it to develop an early film industry. While most early films were non-fictional, newsreels or short documentaries, there were experiments in fiction filmmaking as early as the 1920s and the early 1930s, using European equipment and capital, European-trained technicians, and Egyptian theater actors and actresses, many of whom were already kind of stars on the stage before they made it to the silver screen. Movies were not particularly profitable at the time because there was a big upfront cost in terms of equipment and labor and very few venues to exhibit those movies. But the industry began developing on a wider scale when Studio Misr opened its doors in 1935 because it rented out studio spaces and technicians to smaller producers, and it made post-production possible within Egypt. So it kind of reduced a lot of the cost of making a film. And in parallel, there were many more exhibition venues being built. So the boom in Egyptian cinema happened between the mid-1930s and the late 1950s, at which point the industry started getting nationalized and production numbers dwindled afterwards. During this period, as Andrew Flibbert explains in his doctoral thesis, quote, most of the producers in this period made only 1 or 2 films per year, revealing the disorganized, almost speculative nature of early production and its financing. Domestic and foreign distribution generally was undertaken by the individual producers themselves. A few of them, such as Togo Mizrahi and Studio Misr, led the way by their consistent efforts to make and distribute several films each year. But the vast majority of production was done by much smaller scale operators who either entered the business temporarily or failed to last more than a short while. End quote. So basically, between the mid-1930s and the 1950s, commercial cinema in Egypt had many of the characteristics of early media industries elsewhere in the world. It wasn't centrally organized, which did irritate many post-colonial nation states later on in the 50s. It was financed by investors who didn't necessarily want to stay in cinema long-term. So a lot of one-off investments, and then companies appear and disappear. It relied on a combination of foreign and local capital, equipment, and labor. And it was profitable enough to become a major moneymaker in the 1940s and the 1950s. There's a common cliche among Egyptian film historians that cinema was the second biggest industry after cotton in the late 1940s, which is almost certainly an exaggeration, but it tells you about how economically important the industry had become by then. This commercial context might make you think that early cinema didn't have much to do with the creation of a national culture. And indeed, this is what a lot of Egyptian film critics writing after the 1950s would argue, right? That early films were just cheap entertainment designed to distract the masses and had no significance until the 1952 revolution happened and opened the eyes of the people to the true meaning of nationhood, right? Now, Egyptian cinema, however, has always been invested in the question of Egyptianness, of what makes a real, authentic Egyptian. And it became part of a wider nationalist movement after the 1919 revolution. More specifically, as Armbrust explains in Mass Culture and Modernism in Egypt, early Egyptian cinema brought to the screen a specific historical struggle between a modern, urban middle class and the landed aristocracy, an aristocracy that lorded over what was largely an agricultural country by that point. In chapter 5 of his book, Armbrust analyzes an early movie that clearly puts forward this kind of narrative. The movie is called Al-Ward al-Bayda, or The White Rose, which was made in 1933 and directed by an Egyptian film pioneer called Muhammad Karim, and starring the legendary Egyptian singer, who at this point was still beginning his career, Muhammad Abdul Wahab. I just wanted to show you a brief clip from Al-Ward al-Bayda to illustrate the struggle to define an authentically Egyptian middle class in contradistinction with the aristocracy. The full movie is available on YouTube if you're interested. This clip is one of the initial scenes where the main character, Galal Effendi, courts his aristocratic lover, Raga.
Ceci n'est pas bien accordé.
Je vais retoucher l'octave, monsieur.
Oh, ça va, ça va.
انت تفهم في المزيكا ولا ايه؟
أيوة أفهم شوية.
وتعرف تضرب بيانو؟
لا، أضرب عود.
تضرب عود؟ حاجة بديعة قوي. واتعلمت امتى؟
أنا غاوي من صغري، وكنت أنتهز فرص غياب والدي وأفضل أضرب عود وأغني بالساعات.
وليه كنت تنتهز فرص غياب والدك؟
لأنه كان دايما يمنعني ويقول دي حاجات تعطلك عن دروسك وملهاش قيمة.
ملهاش قيمة؟ ملهاش قيمة ازاي؟
وأكتر من كده، ده كان يقول إياك أنت ناوي تسيب المدرسة وتطلع لي مغناوي. وياما كنت أسمع توبيخ من العينة دي.
L'accord est terminé, mademoiselle.
So the scene isn't analyzed in Armbru's chapter, but it shows the complexity of Galel Effendi's positioning, right? He has an idea about Western music, which is represented by the piano and the tuning expert, and he even knows its intricacies, right? He notices that the piano is off tune, and he tells the tuner in French that it's off tunes. It's very aristocratic knowledge. But when asked if he plays the piano, he strongly asserts that he doesn't, that he instead plays the oud, which is understood as a quintessentially Arab instrument, right? And he goes on to explain how his father put much value into his education, but also how his specific sensibility made him see the importance of music. So Galel Effendi is well educated and westernized enough to converse with his aristocratic love interest, but also he asserts his authentic Egyptianness, right? And this positioning was time and again displayed in different movies and with different resolutions, most often with a marked sympathy towards the urban, educated intelligentsia, which was seen as being best able to negotiate European modernity and local authenticity by being not too Europeanized like the rich were portrayed and not too vulgar as the poor were portrayed. And this is just one small example of how the whole question of national identity and national culture plays out in some of these early media industries. Now, moving on to our third section, in the 1950s, we enter a different era in the history of audiovisual media in the Middle East, which is marked by two important developments. First, we have the creation of national television channels. The first TV station in the Arab world would broadcast out of Baghdad, as I've mentioned, in 1956. In Egypt, it's 1960. In Kuwait, it's 1961. In Abu Dhabi, it's 1969. And these are just some pointers to let you know that it wasn't so long ago, first of all, and that it all roughly happened in the same decade or two. These channels would often rely on a pre-existing radio infrastructure to create a kind of wide-reaching network and to give a labor force to the emerging TV stations. And that's why you'll notice that a lot of times radio and television or broadcasting are often coupled in the same organization. And in many cases, and especially outside of urban centers, radio remains a very important medium, if not the dominant medium. The academic literature tends to talk about these developments as specifically national ones, as though the emergence of television in Iraq was a totally independent event from the emergence of television in Egypt, which isn't the case, of course. And I would encourage you to read Sarah Farhan's article on your further reading lists on this issue. But to be clear, nation states did play a vital role in creating and managing broadcasting infrastructure, with some notable exceptions like in Lebanon. And television was and remains to this day an important vehicle to communicate the state's message. There's no question about this. However, it's important to bear in mind that television infrastructure in the Middle East could not have been built without external aid, both financial and technical. So part of the story of early television in the Middle East is a story of competition among imperial powers and multinational corporations over who would get the lucrative deals to build this new infrastructure. And it's a story which in many ways is similar to any large infrastructural project undertaken by post-colonial nation states, right? You can't understand what's happening nationally without understanding a broader international context. So that's one major development. The second one is the emergence of central state institutions concerned with regulating and censoring audiovisual media production, distribution, and exhibition. There's a tendency to think about these institutions as a kind of caricature of authoritarian control over information, as if the state were just one guy who gets to decide what gets on air and what doesn't. However, it's important to bear in mind that the state itself is a field of competing forces, of different stakeholders. And while media producers in authoritarian contexts don't cross certain lines, certainly they wouldn't criticize the head of state, for example, they still offer a range of programming that reflect this kind of internal competition within the state. So I think it's important to nuance the narrative according to which the post-colonial state used cinema and television purely as a way of creating a new type of national citizen, right? That citizen that's obedient and loyal to the authoritarian leader. I think this narrative implies that because television channels were state-controlled, citizens automatically would become obedient and loyal. And since now we have satellite television and the internet, programming is freer and people are freer. And this is obviously a doubtful claim, as I'll mention later. So it's important to bear in mind that layer of nuance. There are innumerable examples of state-controlled media organizations on your further readings list, but I wanted to give you one example based on some research I've been doing, about which unfortunately there's very little secondary literature written, so you'll get something fresh from me directly today. The example is Afghan Film, which you see on your screen right now, which is a national film institution based in Kabul. The image you likely have about Afghanistan is shaped by decades of war and imperial intervention in the country, going back to the Soviet-Afghan War between 1979 and 1989, all the way down to the US invasion in 2001. However, Afghanistan was a much different country before these wars. It was a monarchy ruled by many dynasties since the late 18th century. And after a new constitution was promulgated in 1964, it became a constitutional monarchy with additional powers given to parliament by King Zahir Shah, which you see on your left, who ruled for about 50 years. This ushered what's called the democratic decade or the constitutional decade by Afghan historians, or historians of Afghanistan, I should say. And it lasted until Prime Minister Dawood Khan, which you see on your right, ousted Zahir Shah in a coup in 1973, and turned the country into an autocratic republic until he himself was assassinated in 1978 during the communist coup. Now, Afghan Film was inaugurated during the so-called democratic decade in 1968, becoming part of a wave of reforms in the state cultural sector. This institution had long been in the works, however, insofar as a project to build a film laboratory in Kabul existed since at least 1962, and it was conceived in collaboration with US Aid. US Aid gave some financial as well as technical support to create this institution. The formal purpose of Afghan Film was to promote film production, distribution, and exhibition in Afghanistan, but its immediate use was to produce government newsreels, that is, educational shorts that are used by the government to propagate its message. While there was little to no budget to produce fiction films, and while the technical and labor infrastructure was almost inexistent at the time, many intellectuals and artists in Kabul were clamoring to create a film industry in the 1960s. Their argument was something along the lines of all modern countries have a film industry, Afghanistan is a modern country or is trying to be one, therefore Afghanistan needs a film industry. And you can read these kinds of arguments in all sorts of state-owned Afghan newspapers such as you see here Anis, Islah, or the English language, the Kabul Times. This project was never successful because the government didn't invest much in the institution called Afghan Film, and there wasn't a significant enough technical and labor infrastructure to make a private film industry profitable. And obviously, a war started in 1979. However, Afghan Film did manage to produce about a dozen fiction films between 1968 and 1978, using very limited funds and relying on a few filmmakers who were trained abroad in the USSR, in Bulgaria, in the United States, and India, among others. These movies had no unified theme or style. Each project was quite idiosyncratic, but many used film to showcase the nation's modernizing achievements in some way. So it's not just the case that Afghan Film is a national cultural institution, but its productions are themselves meant to manifest the nation's emerging culture, and a little like in Armbrust's argument earlier, to show its advances towards modernity. I wanted to show you one brief clip to illustrate this point. The clip is in fact the opening credits of a film called Talabgar, or The Suitor, which was the first ever fiction film made by Afghan Film. Talabgar was one part actually of a three-part movie that was called The Times, or Rozgaran, and it was released in 1970 and directed this specific part by Abdul Khaliq Alil, who went on to direct many more movies in the 1970s. The movie is basically about a bad boy who tries to trick a girl and her father into marrying him, hence the suitor. But I wanted to show you the credits because they make my point about national culture and modernization. And it's a bit long, so you can fast forward through it if you get bored. So this clip begins when the driver turns on the radio in his car, which are two ostensibly modern objects, the radio and the car. But he plays a very classical Afghan song called Bya ke berim ba Mazar, which means let's go to Mazar, which is a city in northern Afghanistan. So already we see a superimposition of traditional and modern elements, which is made clear in the remaining sequence when the song is juxtaposed with the mountainous landscape as the car is driving on a highway. Now, this isn't just any boring old highway, because highways had just been built across the country in the 50s and 60s, and they were the pride and joy of the monarchy. They were the kind of physical evidence of the country's modernization. And this is why I think many early Afghan films, such as this one, featured sequences which are just kind of showcasing the highway as a space on its own, and showcasing the move from the outskirts of Kabul into the city, where you reach the height of modern life in Afghanistan. So even in this short sequence, where there isn't a kind of explicit discourse about the nation and what it's doing, and not much is happening, frankly, you can see how cinema contributes to creating the image of a modern Afghan nation. That's something to bear in mind. Now, moving on to the next section, the next major shift in our history of audiovisual media happens with the emergence of satellite broadcasting. The traditional narrative of the rise of satellite television is well summed up by Muhammad Aish in his co-edited volume called Arab Media. Quote, until the late 1980s, television broadcasting in the Arab world was a local government-monopolized terrestrial operation with limited reach, serving as a mouthpiece for the state on issues of national and international concern. From 1991, however, when the first private Arab world television station went on the air from studio facilities in London, to the present date, which was 2011, television broadcasting in the Arab world has experienced a real revolution, not only in terms of global reach, channel diversity, and program quality, but also in terms of the increased involvement of the private sector in broadcast operations, end quote. Now, the structure of this argument is extremely common in Middle Eastern media studies, where so-called new media are always seen to usher in, quote-unquote, a real revolution, as Aish says. And we'll talk more about this narrative in week 6 when we discuss social media. This kind of argument is problematic because it assumes that whatever came before a certain cutoff point was traditional and changeless, a little like what Aish says about Arab television until the 1980s. And whatever comes after is new and fast changing, right? This assumption masks important continuities before and after the cutoff point. And without in-depth historical research on Arab television between the 1960s and 1990s, it's difficult to lend credence to the argument that satellite television changed everything, right? That said, satellite television did have transformative effects, as Aish says, not only in terms of global reach, channel diversity, and program quality, but also in terms of the increased involvement of the private sector in broadcast operations. And I would also add, it also changed in terms of shifting audience tastes and expectations. And I can give you more to read on this specific issue of audiences and television if you're interested. Satellite television as a technology seems to transcend national borders. If you just buy a satellite receiver, which did mushroom on Middle Eastern rooftops all over the last 25 years, you can have access to the great majority of channels anywhere for free. However, the operative framework still remains very much a national one. Most satellite TV channels seek a specific national audience. They're often spoken in the specific Arab dialect of a particular country. And most satellite channels are owned by national corporations. So the money can come from various locations, but whoever manages it on the ground is still bound by a kind of national framework, national regulations. In fact, the big businessmen owning most television channels in the region maintain strong ties with the existing regimes, and whether by mutuality of interest or by genuine conviction, the narratives broadcast via satellite remain controlled and censored to a certain degree, even if it's not by a centralized state body. So it's not just because the satellite technology is there that you should assume that all national restrictions are on content have ceased. These restrictions still exist, but they're configured in different ways according to the specific balance of power among nation states or among local and regional satellite channels or among private financiers and content producers, without saying anything about the way in which audiences engage with satellite television. So you have to bear in mind all of these contexts. Now, contemporary Turkish TV drama is an interesting case to think through this issue, right? And I've singled out the hit show Dirilish Ertuğrul or Resurrection Ertuğrul on your key readings list to discuss this. The show itself is available with English subtitles on Netflix if you're interested in watching more of it. Ertuğrul is a historical character about which very little is known. We think that he was the head of the Kayı tribe, loyal to Seljuk rulers in the 13th century. We think that he settled in a town called Söğüt, and most significantly in hindsight, we know that he was the father of Osman, who became the founder of the Ottoman dynasty. As Josh Carney explains in his articles, the historical Ertuğrul provides a near blank slate to create a TV series with a character called Ertuğrul, who is portrayed as this kind of virtuous, courageous, and honorable Muslim leader whose every move is predestined to carry Islam's message to the world. Dava in Turkish, which is like da'wah in Arabic or davat in Persian, which has a very strong religious connotation of having a message, a mission. And all these actions are justified by that greater goal. Carney explains that the symmetry between the television Ertuğrul and the Turkish Prime Minister turned President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is not accidental. Erdogan, as well as members of his party, the AKP, used the TV series to lay ownership over an idealized Turkish past where the president embodies, in some sense, the culmination of the nation's historical trajectory. Likewise, actors who work in the show regularly appear at political rallies, either as themselves or in the show's costume, thereby blurring the lines between history, politics, and fiction, and legitimating certain governmental actions. I wanted to show you a brief clip to illustrate the symmetry between Erdogan and Ertuğrul. Resurrection Ertuğrul has 5 seasons of about 100 episodes each, so this clip is really an infinitesimally small sliver of the show. But I've chosen it to illustrate the parallels because I think it works quite well.
Ol deyince olduran, gönüllerimizi imanla dolduran Yüce Allah'ın 99 adıyla. Ben Süleyman Şahoğlu Ertuğrul. Bilinsin ki bu topraklarda zulüm ve korku ortadan kalkmış, yerine adalet gelmiştir. Kimseyi kimseden ayırt etmeyeceğiz. Gayrı hepimiz sulh içinde, huzur içinde yaşayacağız. Yurdumuzu, ticaretimizi adaletle güçlü kılacağız. Bu topraklardaki herkes inancında ve ibadetinde hürdür. Adalet, hürriyet, sükunet, birlik. İşte yasamız budur.
So in the context of the show, this speech was delivered by Ertuğrul to the people of Karacahisar, which is a castle that had been held by the Byzantines until then, until he conquered it. And he conquered it after planning it for over a season and a bit. So it was a pretty momentous event and a momentous speech in the context of the show. And the show is filled with such kind of pompous, declarative speeches, this one being just one of the salient ones. These monologues, in a way, mimic how Erdogan addresses the nation in his public speeches. And the speech response style is more reminiscent of a political rally than it is of a medieval conquest, right? You can imagine that 13th century Ertuğrul wouldn't be so warmly received by the people whose castle he just conquered, let alone want to give a speech in that way. And notice the main themes in the speech as well, if you can go back and look at it. Ertuğrul promises a blend of justice, of free trade, and religious freedom under Islamic rule, which is kind of characteristic of AKP's political program and its particular reimagining of the Ottoman past and their link to that kind of reimagined Ottoman past, which is what Josh Carney calls their restorative nostalgia, right? To restore this kind of great Ottoman greatness. And this is an interesting example of how the satellite age hasn't necessarily dissolved the ability of nation states to influence media content, especially considering that a huge show like Resurrection Ertuğrul could be produced by Turkish state television. However, the satellite age does reconfigure the link between mass media and nationalism in interesting new ways, which this case, I think, and all the interactions between the show and the contemporary politics of Turkey shows quite interestingly. So, to wrap up very briefly, I hope to have given you a sense of the history of cinema and television in the Middle East since the 1930s. I hope to have illustrated how a historical and ethnographic approach gives us more meat to analyze cinema and television than the factoids that are common in Middle Eastern media studies. I have talked briefly about the early age of media industries prior to the 1950s through the case of Egyptian commercial cinema. I have talked about the age of national media organizations between the 1950s and 1980s. Through the case of Afghan film. And I have talked about the satellite age from the 1990s onwards through the case of Turkish serial drama. Throughout this historical survey, I've mentioned how media industries are situated in local, national, and global settings, and how these industries can kind of relate to one another, which we'll explore more next week when we talk about music. I've also invited you to reflect on the question of national culture, right? How does a commercial cinema act as a medium of national expression? How can we understand terrestrial television as a national medium? What part do national media organizations play in creating a national culture? To what extent has satellite broadcasting broken down national control over media discourses? I hope to have given you some pointers to think about these questions and keep on reflecting about them through your readings. And I want to leave you today with this little cartoon. And thank you very much for listening once again.